Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's very special Modern Sales Pros Masterclass and Q&A, all around taking the first steps towards diversity in the workplace. Really excited to have this program and be bringing it to the community. Had an awesome opportunity to work with Varicent to pull this together, and we're joined by Lyse from the team at Varicent, a first-time speaker in MSP. So welcome, Lyse. We're excited to have you.
Thanks, Rich. I'm excited to be here.
And we do have a little bit of a tradition on Modern Sales Pros. Before we jump into the content, we do like to learn a little bit more about our guests. And no tough questions here. I promise we'll save those for later. But for you, any new hobbies or skills that you've picked up since the start of the coronavirus pandemic? Almost a year ago now, my goodness.
I know, it's a year. You know what? I'll tell you, I became an outdoor person. So before this, I was one of those people who were like, yeah, I could take it or leave it. But over the summer, I took up disc golf with my family. So every weekend we were out like hiking and playing disc golf. I don't know if you've ever done that. And then I started winter running. Like
Winter
again, I was not one of those who was gonna like head out on a 5K on minus 10-degree weather before this. I have to tell you, Rich, you got to do it if you haven't. It's been awesome. Yeah.
running.
So that's what I've taken up.
That is now, I mean, winter running, like how cold are we talking? Now, keep in mind, I went to public school here in the States. So is minus 10 like really cold, or is that like just a little bit cold?
No, that's a lot cold.
A lot cold. Okay.
It's a lot cold. When you have the right gear, you're okay, right?
Yeah.
Like I put on my little gaiter and I get myself going. But you got to try it. Clears the mind.
I believe that. Yeah. And just for context for folks that didn't put it together, at least you're outside of Toronto, correct?
I am.
Yeah, so
I
that's for folks trying to figure out the accent. And hold on, she's winter running, and I guess it's winter now. Sorry. There we go. I'm really excited to be having this conversation. At least we had a really great time prepping. But before we jump into today's content, I do want to just say a few words about Modern Sales Pros. Modern Sales Pros is the host of today's event. And for those of you who don't know, Modern Sales Pros is the world's largest community for revenue leaders. So those are folks that are in sales management roles, revenue and sales operations roles, sales enablement, sales development leadership, and the related supporting disciplines. Our mission is to create an environment for our 22,000 and growing members where they can answer questions they'd otherwise struggle to solve on their own. As part of that, we have a robust online forum. We also bring together amazing content programs like what Lyse and I will be talking through today. And specifically for revenue leaders, we do have a commitment to affecting change of issues related to diversity, equality, and inclusion. And as part of that, we have a diversity, equality, and inclusion resources page. It's open for everyone. All of the resources on there have been vetted by the Modern Sales Pros teams. It's certainly not going to answer all the questions for you. It may not even have all the questions, but it's certainly not going to stop you from taking a second and understanding more about yourself and things that you can do and the change that you can affect in your organization. And today's content, as I had mentioned at the beginning, wouldn't be possible without the sponsorship from the team at Varicent. I'm going to hand it over to Lyse to say a few words about Varicent. Lyse.
Oh, thanks, Rich. For everyone who's not familiar, Varicent is the industry-leading SPM solution in the market. Our suite of solutions is designed to help you plan, so you're creating smarter territory plans and quotas, operate, capturing missed opportunities in your pipeline, and finally with pay, compensating your sellers accurately and most importantly on time. We're also really happy to provide 2 apps to any organization for free. Our Simon Gender Pay app and our Diversity app. Again, those are available to any organization to look at your data. And we also are launching our Varicent Edge Scholarship on Monday, March 1st. Edge is Equity, Diversity, Growth, and Empowerment, and it is a scholarship that is available to students who are pursuing a STEM program. It is $5,000 USD for eligible students, either high school grads or existing university college students in Canada and the US. So really excited to share more about Varicent.
Oh, that's awesome, Lyse. We're excited to have you. And today's topic, when we had the opportunity to sit down with Varicent, I jumped at that. I think nobody's perfect on this, and it's a very long road. I don't think anyone's doing it particularly world class. And Varicent has been willing to share a little bit of their own journey. And as part of that, today we're going to hit on a few different topics. But before we jump into that, Lyse, why don't you actually introduce yourself and give us a little bit of your background?
Sure. So as Rich mentioned, Lyse Cornelius-Biggs, I'm currently at Varicent, have been in the talent space for, I guess, over 20 years now. And my experience really is around supporting culture and strategy, using data and technology to move the needle. I've been a part of some really large Canadian organizations as well as US, and now have the opportunity to come to Varicent, who's a growing team, and really use that background using data and technology to make meaningful changes.
We're real excited to have you here, and Lisa's got a phenomenal background to bring. Just two housekeeping notes for members of our audience. First and foremost, please do use the question and answer panel. We've got Lyse for about another 45 minutes, so please do take advantage of this time to ask any questions you have, even if maybe you're a little bit uncomfortable or unsure. Like we said at the beginning, we probably don't even have all the questions, let alone all the answers, but we'll do our best to help give you some perspective. And secondly, for those who may ask usually the first question, the recording will be made available to everybody. We'll share that about 24 hours afterwards. It will go on our DE&I resources page, the YouTube channel, and will be shared with everybody afterwards. So with that, you ready to jump in, Lyse?
Absolutely.
Oh, let's do it. So let's start by starting here, right? We're talking about affecting change and how do we get started with diversity in the workplace. What is it that gets you excited about this topic, about diversity, equality, and inclusion?
You know, I spent a lot of time over the last couple of weeks thinking about why I was excited to talk to you and your community. And what I've come to realize is that I'm excited about talking through diversity, equity, inclusion through the lens of where we recognize it's not easy to just flip a switch and make a change, both from a business and a personal perspective. You know, I feel like nowadays we live in this cancel culture where we make people feel bad if they don't have the answer or if they make mistakes. Yeah. And the DEI journey doesn't mean that you have to know it all. It actually means that even if you're in your early stages, the point that matters is you're doing something, you know, and that's what I really wanted to get across today. We're not here to convince you of why you need DEI initiatives. Like the business cases, it's been proven, right? What we're here today to talk about and why I'm excited about sharing our journey is that you just need to start. We all have different starting points. Yep. And because you may not be leading edge or, you know, this space is new to you, it doesn't mean that you can't make a difference. And in fact, one of the best places to start on your DEI journey is to actually take a step back and ask yourself, where are we today? And what are we trying to achieve? So I'm really excited to be here and have an honest discussion about, you know, how we're approaching our journey to a more diverse and inclusive workforce and how we're using our technology to help others on their journey as well.
Well, I love that point where you kind of feel bad, right? Like, well, are you doing enough? And, you know, maybe you shouldn't be doing that or this. And in reality, I mean, at least you tell me if you agree. I don't think anybody's got this nailed. I don't think there's one organization out there that's knocking it out of the park or anything.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. And quite frankly, the way I see it is anyone who comes to you and says they're an expert, I think you need to fire them. You know, like, let's be real. Like, it's the kind of space where it is continuing to evolve. We are learning, we are unlearning. And so nobody's got this. Nobody has the silver bullet. Nobody has it. But again, what matters is that we're having the conversations and we're moving forward.
Yeah, and learning as we go, right? Because to that point, we're all figuring it out. So let's jump into this a little bit more, right? Diversity can be a pretty loaded term. We can use it all different kinds of ways. How do you think about diversity, or what does that mean to you when we say diversity?
Yeah. So I go back to the basics of it. Diversity, like just from a definition perspective, is about mix, right? And it's a really broad subject, and it means a lot of things to a lot of people. And this is one of the reasons these initiatives can appear so daunting, because you can't boil the ocean. So really, diversity is lots of things. And I think you just have to choose where you want to start, right? And I think you can choose where you want to start by using data to help identify the starting point, right? Using the data to determine what are your priorities and then what steps you choose to take. Because again, diversity could be gender, it could be race, it could be neurodiversity, it could be different levels of ability. Again, it's bigger than a breadbasket, as they like to say.
Well, and I think the other part too of it, and I think actually HubSpot is an organization that's been very transparent about their diversity, inclusion, and belonging initiatives, and they report that out. And so back to Lisa's point on data, if you can't measure it, you can't really improve it. It's really hard to say, oh, we want to do diversity, and it is a little bit more than just hiring a chief diversity officer and going, oh, there we go. We got that. We took care of that. I think we're past that. Like we saw with a lot of what happened with we saw this on the brand side where Dove, they put up the black square on Instagram and they're like, oh, gosh darn it, we're doing it. We're in support. We stand with solidarity. And then it turns out 15 years of disequitable pay between their different models comes out. We have to go beyond just kind of the lip service.
Yeah.
And I know what Lisa is saying here. It sounds like, well, yeah, of course, like let's start with the data, but really don't worry about a lot of what's going on out in the world. Really think about your organization, what it means to you, and what data you can do and affect, and how you start to affect that change.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk about Varicent a little bit more. How is Varicent doing it? And I think a great way to think about this is like, where'd you start? Where are you? Where are you going? Right? Like the kids say, right, in the memes.
Yeah. Here's the thing. Varicent is on a journey. We're on a journey with the clients that we work with as well. And we're using data to determine just that, where we start. And we're asking these same questions internally. Do we start with gender? Do we start with ethnicity? Is there another intersection that we should start with? And we're using a variety of data, and there's a reason for that. And I'll touch on that in a second. But the first thing, one of the data sources we use is our diversity survey. And we launched a diversity survey, which was much broader than just gender and ethnicity. We asked a number of questions, things around gender, but, including non-binary and agender. We asked things around family status. We asked things around people's level of ability and whether they had a disability, because we wanted to gather the data so that we understood and we had perspective around all the various intersections of diversity as well. And we're using that data in twofold. One, to understand the makeup of our workforce, because that gives us a starting point. It also gives us perspective of where we want to go. So if we look at ourselves in terms of, what's our end goal? There really is no end goal, by the way, when you think about this, but you do have to think about what you're working towards. But then it also gives us the ability to look at our data from what do we need to do with to support our internal team. So what do we look like here? And then what is it, the plan that we need to take forward to think about our talent pipeline moving forward. So we're using data in two different ways, and that also helps us with our listening strategy as well. But that's just one example of how we're starting to use our data.
There's a few points in there, and I want to double click in a little bit. At least you make a great point where it's kind of this ongoing program, and then there's some projects throughout it. You're never really done with diversity. And so how do you use the data once you've captured it to figure out what the right projects are to work on, knowing that there's kind of an ever growing number of them?
Yeah, great. So the first thing is diversity. it's more of a strategy than a project, right? And I make that distinction because when you think about diversity, it is around culture and it is around where are you trying to get to. So we use our data and to understand what we look like, but also we've incorporated it into our listening strategy. So we've layered the attributes into our engagement data so that we understand how people are feeling. We also think it's important to use the data to understand your existing practices. So when you think about our diversity app, for example, it gives you a perspective of who are the people coming into your organization and where are they based on level, and then what happens with those people, how do they progress, what are their promotion rates, who's leaving, and we use the data to understand how people move. And then we also have pieces around looking at compensation. So again, looking at our practices, are we paying people fairly and so forth. So as you'll notice that we're using the data not just around understanding today and where we want to go, but we're looking at our practices internally so that we're building a culture of inclusion, and we're addressing our folks who are already on the bench, but then we're also using the data to say where we have gaps so that we can also bring people in from the outside and have a more diverse candidate slate.
That makes a ton of sense. And when we say, data that you've captured here around gender and a few other things, are you capturing that as part of a sort of a pre-employment screen? Is that something that you do on an ongoing basis to your group?
Great question. So we actually ran a census for our internal employees, and we were very transparent with our employees in terms of why we're asking the information. We provided the opportunity to opt out. We are still, for those of you who may know about the Varicent journey, I like to say it, we're building the plane and flying it at the same time. So we're also still building some of our HR practices and processes because it's been the last year that we are now standalone organization. So we will be implementing it and introducing it into earlier on in our talent acquisition process. But at this point in time, we've collected the data from our existing employee population.
That's great. And are there any programs that you've deployed that are maybe worth sharing here based on some data that you saw? I know folks kind of think about this and like, oh, we've got data. Well, what the heck do I do with it?
Yeah. So the first thing, and I like to think about diversity as an outcome, and you're really starting to build a culture of inclusion as your way into it. And so a big thing for us is creating a listening culture. And our Voice of the Employee program is a number of surveys, again, collecting the data from the beginning of an employee's relationship with us. So when an employee comes in, day 30, there's a survey asking them around their experience. Day 60, we ask a subsequent question around, questions like, do you feel cared about as a person? Do you have the information that you need? Then we go into our regular engagement cadence. So when we have our engagement data, we're layering in these additional attributes, the diversity attributes that I mentioned, into our engagement data so that we can get a better perspective around the experiences of people based on the intersections. So for us, that's helped us in terms of being able to double click into how people are feeling and building a sense of belonging. And we're having focus groups, for example, to support us. We're using the data to understand where do things start shifting for folks? How are they feeling? How are they connecting? How can we do things differently at the team level and the organizational level? Again, we use our data as a compass, right? It gives us an opportunity to point us in the right direction, and then we double click to understand where we need to go a little bit deeper.
And I want to ask a sort of a higher level question. This will be a good transition into what's coming up next. How did this come about? We've talked a lot about the capturing the data and all of that, but how did the organization decide to invest in this as a program? Was there a one moment that happened where it was like, yep, we got to do this? Or is this something that you said, it's been in the DNA from the beginning? Like, how did it get started?
What I appreciate about Varicent, we are focused on culture because we hire really smart people. And we are really focused on building a culture of listening and a culture of inclusion. And for us, diversity fits into that. And it fits into that because we think about who are our buyers, and we need to have a team that can support our buyers. That when we walk into a room, our buyers like, okay, there are people who look like me and I want to work with them. We are building SaaS technology, which is used globally. And so as a result, we have to have diverse teams in building our applications and designing, because we need to think about our end user. And so it's a part of, and you know, Mark and I have had this conversation, it's a part of who we need to be to continue to lead in our space. And so that's why we are approaching this as a culture and strategy thing, as opposed to it's a project, now go execute it, right?
And it feels like it's one of those things too, where and we said that a few times, but I do want to say it again for folks. It is a program. You're not done. It's not like you do one thing and you're good, or assign a hiring quota and that takes care of all of the problems. It doesn't. And oftentimes, and the Edge scholarship is so special, oftentimes it's not solving the problem at the right level. Maybe it's a problem in the addressable market of candidates doesn't exist because they're underrepresented in the top of the funnel to even get into the discipline, let alone apply for a job. So it's important to really think that and live that if you can as a culture. And we've started to touch on this a little bit, Lyse, but as other companies are embarking on this journey, what advice do you have as somebody who's seen it at some very, very large brands, some very, very small brands? You've seen it done well. You've seen it done maybe with room for improvement is the right way to say it. But what advice would you have for folks that are maybe thinking about this or getting started with some programs here?
Yeah. I think you need to take a really pragmatic approach and start with the question of, what does this mean to us, right? Like, what do we want it to be? Understanding how that connects into where you are trying to go as an organization and as a business, because it's not enough to say it's the right thing to do. We know that. We would have done it a long time ago. But it really is around being clear on how this supports your customer, how it supports your product, how it supports your employees, and being really clear on that. And then again, I'm going to keep honing back to this. It's around getting the data to understand where you are and then where you want to be, and then setting those milestones and using the data to hold yourself accountable, because like any business metric, what gets measured gets done.
Yeah. No, and I think especially too for some folks in the audience who may be at early stage companies, like, you're not too small to get started with this. Like, it's almost easier to do it when you're only a few folks, I was going to say a few folks in a room, but you folks in a virtual room. And this is something where you can look at, even for the early stage founders, who's on your board? What do those folks look like? If you know diversity is important to you, what are your outside directors? Who are those folks? Is your board representative of the type of organization that you want to build? If it's not, that's a change that as a founder you can start to affect. And then that makes it so much easier, because as Lyse, you tell me if it's different up north, but the number one source of candidates is almost always referrals for new roles, right?
Yeah.
And so if your team is a bunch of lacrosse players from Cornell who all went to Phillips Academy, chances are they know other lacrosse players from Cornell that went to Phillips Academy. If that's all you hire, and then as your team gets bigger, it becomes a much harder problem because you've got a strong monoculture. So you actually have to do more work versus being mindful about it. And I think intentionality is a word that Lyse has said a few times here. Unless you're intentional about it from the beginning, you can end up having a ton more work to do. Even if you want to, even if you mobilize the entire organization behind it, it can be a pain in the butt if you don't really think about this through when you're starting.
Absolutely.
And then one other thing that often comes up, and this is a question that's come up in registration, and I just want to take a second because I'm sure someone's going to ask, is like, well, I have to hire now. I don't have time to go find diverse candidate X, Y, and Z. Lyse, I know you sit on the talent side of this, but how do you, when we think about kind of when you're working with a hiring manager, how do you how do you manage that that expectation of I need to hire right away? I needed 3 people yesterday, and I don't care. I want just give me the best candidates.
Yeah, yeah. So the answer is, are you sure that the best candidate always comes from within the narrow network that you have, right? Um, it really is around, okay, absolutely, we need to hire. Now let's talk about what we're looking for, truly what we're looking for to do this job, right? Because get caught on that one. And then let's talk about where we're sourcing, right? Because at the end of the day, it's around, did you look and did you actually expand the network that you were casting your net, right? If we can justify that we've cast our net and we actually looked in different places, if we're seeking women developers or women in sales or what have you, then that's a different conversation. But if you didn't even start, then I understand speed, all about it, but we also have to put in the effort. And again, goes back to being intentional, right? Being intentional because the objective is to find the best candidate. And I find it really hard to believe that the best candidate always only comes from a really small pipe.
But I mean, it's so fast, Lyse. I talked to the 3 people I know, and they referred to me as their friends. One other point, and we talk about this a lot in modern sales, just in general, right? Of being intentional when you're running a discovery process, being intentional about the questions that you're asking. What role does the interview process play in setting the stage for inclusivity at an organization?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'd actually take a step back before the interview process, right? So, Rich, I think it's important, to be really clear on what are you looking for in the job and being aware of how you write that job description, because there's certain language and terminology that are geared a little bit on the gender perspective or ethnic perspective as well. But then in the selection, right? Are there things that you can do to, reduce bias when you're going through the selection? And then the interview, ensuring that you're asking the same questions to everybody, ensuring that you're using the same criteria, and in some cases using blind assessment so that as you're assessing simply what you're seeing in front of you, as opposed to the person or the name or, any of those other attributes.
And one other piece of feedback on this too, at least that's a fabulous answer, is don't culture fit.
Yeah.
Oh, I've heard about that. Oh yeah, I couldn't see myself grabbing a beer with that guy, at least. How that's a cop out in a lot of instances. So like Lyse was saying, in terms of deliberate, understand what you're interviewing for, train on it. It's the same thing with culture. Culture doesn't get to be the CEO didn't like you, so we're not hiring you. It's got to be better than that.
Absolutely.
So I want to jump in a little bit more to some of the technology that Varicent has actually built here. I know you've got a few different apps. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and how that can help companies on their DE&I journeys?
Absolutely. So Varicent has the two specific apps. One is our gender pay app, where companies can load their data and have a perspective around how they're allocating rewards based on gender. And we know that this is a legal requirement in some jurisdictions, but it's also helpful, if it's not legislated for you, to really understand what is that difference with your women and male colleagues. How are you rewarding bonuses and salaries and so forth? So our gender pay gap is available and free for any organization to really look at their internal practices. The second app that we have is our Simon Diversity app, and that helps us to understand, using data, your talent pipeline. So really helping to understand churn across your various groups, understanding how they're coming in, where they are sitting within the organization. Really, again, giving us the right data points to point to where you're going to start your interventions.
I think they're great tools, and everyone should certainly check those out. We've got a little bit more time with Lyse here, and I know there's a bunch of great questions that were asked during registration. For our attendees, please do use that Q&A panel, and we'll try to get to them. I'm going to ask one. It's kind of my favorite one. Sales is a little bit of a bro culture, right? That's the age old. You see the Wolf of Wall Street, and my last sales leader was a big martini and steak dinner and kind of guy. What have you seen, or what advice do you have for folks to maybe combat that bro culture, to make sales specifically a little bit more inclusive for everybody?
That's a great question.
I suppose we could apply it. I mean, engineering is, they don't have that same, there's no Wolf of Amazon Web Services or whatever the equivalent would be. But I think there are these certain roles that end up being a little bit more male dominated, and that culture permeates. What have you seen organizations do to combat that a little bit?
Yeah, great question. So there are a few things, right? It's from an organizational level, it's really around the behaviors that you accept. And I'm a real strong believer in not calling people out, but calling people in terms of, let's talk about some of these behaviors and how you might be perceived and what works and what doesn't. The other piece is recognizing that if you are not intentionally including people, you are unintentionally excluding them, right? And so for sales leaders, what I would ask is being intentional and thinking about, am I thinking about my impact on others? And am I intentionally trying to bring people in and making space and room for other voices that don't necessarily sound like mine, or faces that look like me as well. So it really is around that intention, and also holding each other accountable, because even in bro cultures, there is the ability to stand back and say, hold on, gents, I don't know if we're covering the full the full spectrum of this problem. Maybe we don't have enough voices or faces around this table.
I think that's a great perspective to have on the sort of, if you're not thinking about inclusion, you're probably, good chance you're being exclusionary in some way, shape, or form. I also think on that point, I love that idea of inviting in versus calling somebody out. Hey, when you say this thing, how do you think that sounds to that team? Maybe not the look that you're going for here.
Or sometimes when you play things back to people, right? Like, hey, I'm going to play back what I just heard. What's that doing for you? Right?
Is that what you think you said? Because that's what, yeah. I like that. I like, that's great. So we talked a little bit about the gender pay gap app. What if someone's using that and says, hey, they see there's a big gap there, how would you recommend starting to advocate for that change, right? To close that gender pay gap? I know it sounds obvious, right? And for folks here, it may be a little bit, hold on, well, we should close that. It's just an imperative. But how would you recommend that they start to advocate for closing that pay gap at a high growth organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So the reality is, you've done the first step in terms of getting the data, right? Because the worst thing to do is say, oh, I have a hunch that it's there. You can't go to your CFO with a hunch, right? You need to go to the CFO with the data in terms of this is what it looks like. And then it's about building out a plan. So, are you gonna do it overnight? Maybe not, depending on what the gap is, but it really is around setting a plan, setting a reasonable plan as well, to correct the discrepancy, right? And then being transparent about it, right? And ensuring that you go back into your practices to ensure that it doesn't happen again.
Oh, I think those are great points. And this is actually interesting. And Lyse, this is something I saw earlier this week on LinkedIn, and I'm going to put you on the spot on this one. Sorry, it's top of mind for me. Right. In terms of UC organizations, they have a diversity and inclusion statement associated with a role. And then you try to inspect their organization for like, okay, cool, I see it. There's nothing else out there about diversity. There's no mix of diversity in their organization, or it's tough to find. How have you seen organizations pull those pieces together? So it's not just a statement on a job description, but it is actually evident that it is an inclusionary environment and they are fostering a sense of diversity.
And your question is, how have I seen organizations do
How
it?
have you seen organizations do that reasonably well? Do you think that's important?
Yeah. So yes, it is absolutely important. Um, It's interesting that you raise this because unfortunately, so many organizations feel that they put in a statement and they're done. They're like, yes, this is good. We are good. We said we stand with, and here you go. Um, but the reality is, it's in everything you do and every action that you take. And one of the things, and I'm going to toot our horn to be perfectly honest at Varicent, because I'm pretty proud of the work that we're doing. But it's around what you say to the outside and it's around what you do internally, right? And so for us, we have the commitment to the outside community with our Varicent Edge Scholarship and the apps that we've developed because we think this is so important. But we didn't stop there. We also look at our internal culture. And again, we're not just looking at ticking off a bunch of boxes to say, yeah, we have this many bums in seats. We're saying, how do we build a culture of inclusion so that no matter who you are, you feel like you are a part of something bigger? Um, and then we're also ensuring that our practices and processes all will fall in line with that as well. So the voice that we share to the external world is congruent with who we say we are internally. And I think when organizations get to a place of having that congruence and ensuring that they're both walking the walk and talking the talk, because it's not just one or the other, I think that that's when you breathe life into that, statement that you put on your website.
And I think there's a part of it that's back to what we were saying before too, with the intentionality. Like
Yeah.
you got to start by starting, and maybe you don't have that statement, you get it up on your website today. That's a step, right? Let's celebrate that, and then the next step, starting to make sure that we're living and breathing this a little bit more in terms of what we're doing externally. And I think that that's a point where in a lot of questions come up around recruiting. And it's an interesting thing. I was chatting with somebody the other day, and they're like, "Oh, I've got a very senior, very technical role, and they've got to interview a certain number of diverse candidates for it." It's a really interesting problem to unpack because it's like going to a sales rep and saying, "We're going to double your quota," but it doesn't matter if it's out there in the market. Where in his case, the total addressable market and he was looking in Colorado
Yeah.
for a senior, this specialty in engineering, there was 3 people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's great, right? That's great data, but it's something where that's not the problem started years before that. And that's what I love about the Edge Scholarship. And this is when Lisa's talking about, there may be folks on this phone that are like, whoa, how else can I get started? There's all sorts of ways to get involved with programs, the Edge Scholarship. There's organizations like SV Academy and Climb Higher, Vendition, and others where you can provide some of your own time to start to help others and sort of increase the talent at the entry level, which then over time, right? This isn't a project, it's a program. Over time, that does start to give us more diverse sales leaders, sales development leaders, engineers, et cetera. So as I'm looking through kind of questions that have come in here, they're like, okay, cool, how do I do recruiting? And I'm looking for specific senior level role. It's like, oh, the market's not that big there. All right, Lise, I'm gonna ask one more question here for you. If an organization's getting started today, right? We've touched on this a little bit, talked about the data. Is there one program that you'd recommend they not do? Right, something that you've seen that's maybe well-intentioned, but it's too big to start with, or it's too grandiose, and it maybe doesn't go as well as an organization would hope.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Don't try to train your way out of this, or train your way into it, however you want to position it, right? Again, you got to be really clear on what it looks like because diversity, equity, inclusion is around strategy and it is around culture. You can't send people on a 1 hour, 2 hour course and think, all right, I'm done, we're good, check mark. So I would say that's my first one, and the second one is this isn't a checkbox exercise, and be really cognizant about creating the in and the out. And I say that on both sides because, we talk about diverse candidates. And if we set quotas, that we're setting that person up for failure, quite frankly, because who wants to be that person who people think that they only got their job because of, and we also don't want to alienate their colleagues because again, they're looking at, well, can you really do your job? Or are you just there for, so just those are the two I would say is just be really cognizant about creating that in and out group and also just recognize you can't train your way into it.
This has been a really fun conversation, Lyse. I know you're super, super busy, and this is a pretty heavyweight topic. So thank you for taking some time to share. Just as a reminder, folks, please do take a peek at both the gender pay gap and the other app and the Edge scholarship program that Varicent has. Those will also live on the Modern Sales Pros Diversity, Equality, and Inclusion resources page for revenue leaders. Lyse, once again, on behalf of the entire community, the folks that joined us here today and the folks watching in the future on YouTube, I really appreciate you taking some time, and thank you so much for sharing your perspective here. This was really fun.
Thanks for having me, Rich. I've had some fun.
Awesome. Well, stay safe and have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.